I thought family meant unconditional love until Mom and Sarah cornered me at dinner and delivered the most devastating verbal attack that shattered my self-worth completely. The past few months have been rough. I've been floating through life like a ghost, barely keeping my head above water. My job felt meaningless, my apartment was a mess, and I'd been canceling plans with friends more often than not. I knew I wasn't doing great, but I thought I was hiding it well enough. That's when I started noticing the whispers. Mom and my sister would stop talking whenever I entered the room. They'd exchange these meaningful looks across the dinner table like they were sharing some secret I wasn't part of. I caught them having hushed phone conversations that would abruptly end when I walked by. The tension in our house was thick enough to cut with a knife. I tried asking them about it a few times, but they'd just brush me off with fake smiles and change the subject. Part of me wondered if they were planning some kind of intervention, but I pushed that thought away. Things weren't that bad, right? Sure, I'd been struggling, but everyone goes through rough patches. The breaking point came on a Sunday evening. We were having our usual family dinner, something we'd done every week since I was a kid. The table was set with Mom's good china, the kind she only brought out for special occasions or when she wanted to make a point. I should have known something was up. I was picking at my food, not really hungry, when the conversation suddenly died. The silence stretched on until it became uncomfortable. I looked up to find both Mom and Sarah staring at me with expressions I'd never seen before. Cold. Calculating. Like they were sizing up an opponent. Mom cleared her throat and set down her fork with deliberate precision. The sound echoed in the quiet room like a gavel falling. Sarah shifted in her chair, her posture straightening as if she was preparing for battle. What happened next was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. They took turns like they'd rehearsed it. Mom started by listing every mistake I'd made in the past year. Every missed opportunity, every half-hearted attempt at improvement, every time I'd disappointed them. She spoke with clinical detachment as if she was reading from a prepared statement. Then Sarah jumped in, her voice sharp and cutting. She brought up things from years ago, failures I thought were long forgotten. The time I dropped out of that evening class. The relationship I'd sabotaged because I was too scared to commit. The way I'd stopped trying to advance at work, content to just coast along doing the bare minimum. They called me a disappointment. A waste of space. They said I'd never accomplished anything meaningful in my entire life. Every word hit like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of me. I sat there, frozen, as they systematically destroyed every shred of self-worth I had left. The worst part was how methodical it was. They weren't angry or emotional. They spoke with the kind of calm certainty that made their words feel like absolute truth. Like they'd been discussing my failures for weeks and had come to this conclusion together. I felt my world crumbling around me. These were the two people who were supposed to love me unconditionally, who were supposed to be in my corner no matter what. Instead, they were confirming every negative thought I'd ever had about myself. I wanted to defend myself, to fight back, to prove them wrong. But the words wouldn't come. I just sat there, feeling smaller and smaller with each passing moment. Part of me wondered if this was rock bottom, if things could possibly get any worse. Update 1. The attack continued for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. They didn't raise their voices or get dramatic about it. That somehow made it worse. It was like they were calmly explaining why I was fundamentally broken as a person. Sarah mentioned how I'd been different since college, how I'd lost all my drive and ambition. She talked about how embarrassing it was to tell people what I did for work, how she had to make excuses for why I never had anyone special in my life. Mom nodded along, adding her own observations about how I'd become a shell of the person I used to be. They brought up specific incidents that I tried to forget. The time I'd called in sick to work for 3 days straight because I couldn't bring myself to get out of bed. The way I'd stopped answering my phone for weeks, ignoring calls from friends who eventually stopped trying to reach me. The family gatherings where I'd sit in the corner, barely participating in conversations. I felt like I was watching my life being dissected by strangers. Every weakness, every moment of vulnerability, every time I'd struggled was being used as evidence against me. They painted a picture of someone who had given up on life, who was dragging everyone else down with their negativity. The really crushing part was how accurate some of it was. I had been struggling. I had been isolating myself. I had been going through the motions instead of really living. But hearing it laid out like that, presented as proof of my fundamental worthlessness, was devastating. I started to feel dizzy. My hands were shaking under the table and I could feel tears threatening to spill over. I'd never felt so exposed, so completely vulnerable. It was like they'd stripped away every defense I had and left me with nothing. Then something strange happened. Mom's voice started to crack. Just slightly at first, but enough that I noticed. Sarah's rigid posture began to soften. I looked up, confused, and saw something I wasn't expecting. They were both crying. Not the angry, frustrated tears I might have understood. These were different. Desperate. Heartbroken. Like they were in as much pain as I was. The shift in the room was immediate and jarring. One moment they were methodically tearing me apart, and the next they looked like they were about to fall apart themselves. Sarah's hands were trembling as she reached for her napkin. Mom's composed facade cracked completely, and she buried her face in her hands. I sat there, completely confused. Nothing made sense anymore. Why were they crying? What was happening? The emotional whiplash was almost too much to process. Update 2. The silence that followed was deafening. Both of them were crying now, really crying, and I had no idea what to do with that information. My brain couldn't process the sudden shift from brutal honesty to what looked like genuine anguish. Sarah was the first to speak, her voice thick with tears. She started apologizing, but not for the things I expected. She wasn't sorry for what she'd said. She was sorry for having to say it. That's when the real bombshell dropped. Mom looked up from her hands, her face streaked with tears, and explained that none of what they'd just said was how they really felt. They'd been working with someone, a professional who specialized in helping families in crisis. This person had suggested something called reverse psychology. They'd been watching me fade away for months. Watching me give up on everything that used to matter to me. They'd tried gentle encouragement, tried being supportive, tried giving me space. Nothing had worked. I just kept sinking deeper into this pit of apathy and self-doubt. The professional had suggested that sometimes people need to be shocked into defending themselves. That sometimes the only way to get someone to fight back is to attack the things they care about most. In this case, that meant attacking my sense of self-worth in the most brutal way possible. They'd spent weeks preparing for this dinner, writing down every criticism, every disappointment, every failure they could think of. Not because they believed these things, but because they thought it might be the only way to wake me up, to make me angry enough to fight back. The plan was that I would get defensive, that I would argue with them, defend my choices, prove them wrong, that the anger would snap me out of the fog I'd been living in and remind me that I was worth fighting for. Instead, I just sat there and taken it, absorbed every blow without fighting back, proved to them that I was even further gone than they'd feared. Sarah was sobbing now, talking about how terrified she'd been watching me disappear, how she'd been having nightmares about losing me completely, how she'd been willing to risk our relationship if it meant saving my life. Mom was nodding along, explaining how they'd been scared to do nothing, how they'd felt like they were watching me slowly die inside and didn't know how else to reach me, how desperate they'd been to try anything that might work. The professional had warned them that this approach was risky, that it might backfire spectacularly. But they'd been so worried about me that they'd been willing to take that chance. I felt like I was in some kind of alternate reality. Everything I thought I knew about the past few months was suddenly turned upside down. The whispers, the looks, the tension, it had all been about trying to save me, not judge me. But that revelation came with its own set of problems. The damage was done. Every word they'd said was now burned into my memory. Even knowing they didn't mean it, even understanding their motivation, I couldn't unhear what they'd said. Part of me was angry. Furious, actually. How could they think this was okay? How could they put me through the kind of emotional torture, even with good intentions? The betrayal felt almost worse knowing it was calculated. But another part of me was starting to understand. They'd been desperate. They'd been watching someone they loved slip away and had tried everything else first. This wasn't their first choice, it was their last resort. Update 3. The days that followed were some of the strangest of my life. I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. I kept replaying every word, every moment, trying to separate what was real from what was performance. The hardest part was figuring out how I felt about it all. I was angry, definitely. Hurt. Confused. But there was something else too, something I hadn't expected. For the first time in months, I felt something other than numbness. Sarah called me every day that week. Not to apologize again, but just to check in. To make sure I was okay. To remind me that she loved me, that she'd always loved me, that nothing they'd said during that dinner reflected how she really felt. Mom was more subdued. I could tell she was second-guessing the whole thing, wondering if they'd made a terrible mistake. She kept bringing me food, little care packages left outside my door with notes attached. Simple things like thinking of you or love you always. I started paying attention to my own reactions in a way I hadn't in months. The anger was actually energizing. I found myself wanting to prove them wrong, even though I knew logically that proving them wrong meant proving that their strategy had worked. I began to see myself through their eyes. Not the cruel words they'd said at dinner, but the way they'd been watching me for months. The gradual withdrawal, the lack of enthusiasm, the way I'd stopped caring about anything. I realized I'd been sleepwalking through my life. The professional they'd been working with had suggested that I might benefit from talking to someone too. Not therapy exactly, but something more like life coaching. Someone who could help me figure out what I actually wanted from life instead of just drifting along. At first, I was resistant. The whole thing felt too orchestrated, too much like I was being managed. But then I started thinking about what they'd said about me not fighting back. About not defending myself. About accepting their criticism without question. That bothered me more than anything else. Not that they'd said those things, but that I'd believed them so readily. That I'd been so quick to accept their assessment of my worth without even considering whether it was accurate. I started making small changes. Nothing dramatic, just little things that proved to myself that I was still capable of action. I cleaned my apartment, really cleaned it for the first time in months. I called a friend I'd been avoiding. I showed up to work 15 minutes early instead of sliding in at the last possible moment. Each small victory felt disproportionately huge. Like I was proving something to myself, reclaiming pieces of who I used to be. The breakthrough came about 2 weeks after the dinner. I was having coffee with Sarah, our first real conversation since everything had happened. She was being careful, walking on eggshells, clearly terrified of saying the wrong thing. I realized I was tired of being handled with kid gloves. Tired of being seen as fragile. Tired of being the problem that everyone else had to solve. So I told her exactly what I thought about their little plan. How manipulative it was. How it had felt like a betrayal. How they'd taken advantage of my trust and used it against me. But I also told her I understood why they'd done it. That I could see now how worried they'd been. How my withdrawal had affected them too. How they'd been suffering right alongside me, watching helplessly as I faded away. Sarah started crying again, but this time it was different. Relief, maybe? Or just exhaustion from carrying around all that worry for so long. That's when I realized something important. The whole experience had been terrible, but it had also been a wake-up call. Not in the way they'd planned exactly, but in a way that was uniquely mine. I'd been so focused on my own pain that I'd forgotten other people cared about me. I'd been so convinced of my own worthlessness that I'd stopped fighting for myself. I'd been so afraid of failing that I'd stopped trying altogether. The dinner had been a shock to my system, but not in the way they'd intended. Instead of making me angry at them, it had made me angry at myself. Angry at the way I'd been living. Angry at the way I'd been treating the people who loved me. Final update. The real turning point came when I stopped focusing on what they'd done and started focusing on what I was going to do about it. The anger I felt, the hurt, the confusion, all of it was energy I could use. Energy I'd been lacking for months. I started by having honest conversations with both of them. Not about forgiveness or apologies, but about what came next. About how we were going to move forward as a family. About what I needed from them and what they needed from me. Mom admitted that she'd been scared to say anything about my struggles before because she didn't want to make things worse. She'd been watching me carefully, noting every small change, every sign that I was pulling away. But she'd been paralyzed by the fear of saying the wrong thing. Sarah confessed that she'd been angry at me for months before the dinner. Angry that I was wasting my potential, angry that I'd stopped caring about things that used to matter to me, angry that I wouldn't let her help. The reverse psychology plan had given her permission to express that anger in a way that felt constructive. Understanding their perspectives helped, but it didn't erase what had happened. The words they'd said were still there, still painful. But I began to see them differently. Not as truth, but as a mirror reflecting my own fears about myself. I realized that the reason their words had hurt so much wasn't because they were accurate, but because they echoed things I'd been thinking about myself. They'd simply voiced the internal criticism I'd been carrying around for months. That was when I decided to fight back. Not against them, but against the voice in my head that had been telling me I wasn't worth the effort. The voice that had convinced me to stop trying, to stop caring, to stop fighting for the life I wanted. I started small. I made a list of things I'd accomplished, things I was proud of, things that proved I wasn't the failure they'd described. It was harder than I expected. I'd been so focused on my shortcomings that I'd forgotten I had any strengths at all. Then I made a list of things I wanted to change. Not because someone else thought I should, but because I wanted to. Because I deserved better than the life I'd been settling for. I started taking better care of myself. Not just the basics, but the things that made me feel like myself again. I started reading again, something I'd loved but had somehow stopped doing. I started cooking real meals instead of living on takeout and frozen dinners. I started taking walks in the evening just to get out of the house and remember what fresh air felt like. The changes were gradual but noticeable. I had more energy. I felt more present in conversations. I started looking forward to things again instead of just enduring them. My relationship with Mom and Sarah evolved too. We were more honest with each other now, more direct. The experience had taught all of us that dancing around difficult topics wasn't protecting anyone. If anything, it was making things worse. We established new boundaries. They agreed to talk to me directly if they were worried about me instead of whispering to each other. I agreed to be more open about my struggles instead of pretending everything was fine. The professional they'd been working with suggested family sessions, but I wasn't ready for that. I needed to work on myself first, to figure out who I was when I wasn't defined by my problems. I found other ways to get support. I joined a group for people dealing with similar issues. Not traditional therapy, but more like a support network. People who understood what it felt like to lose yourself and were working on finding their way back. I also started journaling, something I'd never done before. Writing down my thoughts helped me process everything that had happened. It helped me separate my feelings from my facts, my fears from my reality. Months later, I could look back on that dinner with something approaching gratitude. Not for the pain they'd caused, but for the wake-up call it had provided. They'd been wrong about the method, but right about the need for action. I wasn't the same person who had sat at that table absorbing criticism without fighting back. I was someone who had learned to advocate for herself, to recognize her own worth, to fight for the life she wanted. The experience taught me that sometimes the people who love us most are the ones who are willing to risk everything to save us. Even when they do it imperfectly. Even when they hurt us in the process. Even when their methods are questionable and their execution is flawed. It also taught me that I was stronger than I thought. That I could survive having my worst fears about myself spoken out loud. That I could take the pain and transform it into something useful. Our family dinners are different now. We still gather every Sunday, but the conversation is more real. We talk about actual things instead of polite small talk. We check in with each other honestly instead of pretending everything is always fine. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if they'd never staged that intervention. If they just continued watching me fade away, hoping I'd eventually snap out of it on my own. I might still be drifting, still sleepwalking through my life, still convinced that mediocrity was all I deserved. Instead, I'm awake. I'm fighting. I'm living deliberately instead of just existing. It wasn't the path any of us would have chosen, but it led me back to myself. And that, more than any apology or explanation, makes it all worthwhile.